I hope you enjoyed that interview with Congressman DeSaulnier. We're really grateful to have someone like him in Congress advocating on behalf of cancer survivors. When we do our State of Cancer Survivorship Survey every year, our results last year showed across the board, adolescent and young adult cancer survivors had higher levels of concern for emotional, mental health, financial, and physical concerns, and less support from their care team. So we felt like this was a really important discussion to have. And now I'm going to hand it over to my wonderful colleague, Dr. Panagiotou, to moderate this panel discussion. Veronika?
Thank you, Shelley. It's an honor to be here today. Thank you for everyone who is attending. I can't wait to be able to advocate for the legislation that we just heard about, and we'll be doing that the rest of the week. Our next session, and it's an honor to be able to introduce these young adult cancer researchers to you and to have them share their work. Lauren Ghazal is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Michigan School of Nursing. Not only is she a family nurse practitioner, she studies young adult and adolescent survivorship around work, financial toxicity, and other quality of life concerns. Our next presenter will be Dr. Emily Wallings. She is a clinical assistant professor at the University of Michigan's Mott Children's Hospital. She is founded and the co-medical director of the Adolescent and Young Adult Oncology Program. And finally, Dr. Nick Iannarino is an associate professor of health communications at the University of Michigan, Dearborn. He studies people in close relationships and how they manage their social experiences with severe and chronic illness. I want to thank you all for being here and sharing your time with us and the young adult experience. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for having us today. Hopefully you can see my screen. Please let me know if you can't. But let's go ahead and jump in. And the three of us will kind of introduce ourselves a little bit more beyond what Veronika just did. Thank you for Veronika for doing that. But in a few minutes, we'll kind of jump back and tell you a little bit more about us. So as many of you might already know, in 2006, the National Cancer Institute designated 15 to 39-year-olds with cancer as their own age distinct group called adolescents and young adults, or AYAs. So this is partially because since 1975, AYAs have seen little improvement in survival rates compared to pediatric and older adult patients. So see the yellow bars there showing negligible increase and in some cases decrease in survival rates over time, especially compared to those other groups. So over 90,000 adolescents and young adults are still diagnosed annually, and over 500,000 AYAs, cancer survivors currently live in the United States. And so the NCI kind of attributed this lack of improvement to a number of factors, including delayed diagnosis, lack of insurance, little enrollment in clinical trials, and these multiple age distinct social, emotional, and transitional challenges that can affect AYA's treatment adherence and decision-making all the way from diagnosis up to post-treatment survivorship. So this is a time in a person's life when things are, left pretty intentionally up in the air. It's a time to experiment and figure out who you are. And then cancer kind of comes along and makes this process even harder. So first, cancer can delay and sometimes completely prevent AYAs from things like finishing school or moving into stable careers and achieving financial and parental independence. Second, they often struggle to initiate new relationships after diagnosis, and their existing relationships are already in flux and less solidified at this stage of life, even before they get cancer. So finding and keeping helpful support is usually really tough in this context. Third, they also feel that they have little access to helpful age-specific resources. So as a result, they don't get the opportunity to meet other young adult or adolescent young adult survivors or patients. They're the youngest person in the face-to-face support groups that are available to them, and they're often filled with breast and prostate cancer patients in their 60s and 70s. And so their questions about going to college or dating or having kids while going through cancer treatment can often go unanswered. So healthcare providers often don't refer to them to the resources that do exist and that were developed just for them. And so overall, AYAs pursue fewer mental health, complementary and alternative medicine, and online health and support services than older and younger patients. Finally, we don't know very much about the social struggles that AYAs who closely support an AYA with cancer face. So they probably experience their own significant life disruption and social struggles while providing intense support at an unexpected time of their life. It's also not surprising that AYA's needs are still not being met in survivorship, after primary cancer treatment ends. So even 1 year post-diagnosis, close to half of AYAs still wished they had more information, counseling, and support, often about issues like fear of recurrence and survivor's guilt and questions about infertility risk. So Dr. Archie Blair, who has been one of the main oncology research advocates for AYAs over the last 15 years, said in 2007 that, quote, "The greatest difference in the management of AYA patients is the supportive care, particularly the psychosocial care that they require. These patients have special needs that are not only unique to their age group, but are also broader in scope and more intense than those at any other time of life." So by that token, it makes sense that anytime we as researchers and practitioners and advocates and policymakers can talk to AYAs with cancer as experts of their own experiences, we should do it. And because understanding the behavioral and the social and the environmental context of their lives is so critical for the delivery of cancer care that treats the person as a whole, right? So again, as this quote here says, there's also a huge desire among AYAs to connect with one another and to send and receive social support that can help them feel, better understood and less alone, particularly in survivorship. So today, my co-presenters and I are going to talk to you about the advice that adolescents and young adults who have experienced a cancer diagnosis have for other AYAs who are going through something similar. And so today, I want us to see how maybe this information can benefit other cancer survivors, cancer caregivers, healthcare providers, and all of us who are interested in, like Representative Desaulnier who talked about, policy change. So I think advice is interesting because not only can studying it teach us more about AYA's experiences of disruption or burden or unmet needs, these things that go kind of unresolved during cancer diagnosis or that they struggle with, but it can also be a useful framework that helps us better understand kind of the coping and the self-management strategies that go on outside of the doctor's office that these AYAs are kind of employing in a more informal setting, right? These things that they did use or that they wish they used or that they didn't use and still had for advice for others, so that we can learn a little bit more about their experience. So our goal here today, obviously to share some ideas with you that can hopefully help improve AYA psychosocial outcomes going forward. So I told you we'd tell you a little bit more about ourselves and why we're well positioned to discuss this. I'll talk really quickly about myself and then pass it over to Lauren and Emily. But I am a PhD in health communication. I study the exchange of messages having to do with wellness and health in general. And I focus a lot on young adults with cancer and kind of their support networks. How can they have a little bit better help and support for one another so they can achieve better outcomes. I've been doing this work for since about 2010. I did my PhD at University of Kentucky. And so Lauren or Emily, if you guys want to jump in now and talk a little bit about yourselves too.
Thanks, Nick. I'm Emily Walling. I'm a pediatric oncologist at University of Michigan, and I, about 4 years ago, started the AYA oncology group here. And so I'm really excited to be here and tell you guys about one of our first studies that came out of our group.
And I am Lauren Ghazal. I bring a different perspective as a nurse practitioner and also as a young adult cancer survivor. I was diagnosed with stage 2 Hodgkin lymphoma in the first year of my PhD program, and that experience alone completely shifted the trajectory of where I wanted to take my research career. And so I continued to study and focus on adolescent young adult cancer survivors and bring in my background in economics and in nursing to look at work-related goals, employment outcomes, look at financial toxicity and health among this population. And currently I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and just really excited to be here and speak with Nick and Emily on this special presentation focused on AYAs.
Yeah, I'm thrilled that Lauren and Emily said yes when I asked them to join this panel. So it'll be really fun to talk a little bit about some of kind of our individual data sets. Because what the study, or what we're going to talk about today, basically, we're going to be taking 4 different data sets that that we collected over kind of our time as researchers, and all these data sets have something in common where we asked participants, whether they're adolescents and young adults or just young adults, we asked them to give us advice or to talk about things that they basically learned at the end of their cancer experience, or at least at the end of treatment and into survivorship, that they wish they had known at diagnosis. And so we had pretty much across these studies 4 different themes more or less in common. And so we're going to talk about attitude framing, and Emily's going to kick us off with that before I touch on engaging support network and self-advocating with the healthcare team. And then Lauren finishing up with normalizing mental health support. So let's turn it over to Emily.
Thanks so much, Nick. And let me apologize for the lighting. I am coming to you all live from one of our clinic rooms. So it's less than ideal. So I wanted to talk to you guys about when we formed the adolescent and young adult group here. We were very intentional about also forming a research arm, not only a clinical kind of patient-facing arm, but also a research arm dedicated to really exploring unmet, needs and addressing these issues among this vulnerable patient population. And this is actually how I met Nick, was during our first study all together. So we formed this multidisciplinary group of researchers who were interested in AYA oncology. And so this first study is kind of the subset of a larger study that was originally aimed at looking at AYA's experience with fertility preservation. It was a qualitative study, and our researchers asked a really interesting question, which was, what advice would you have for others, or what would you have wanted to know going into cancer therapy and treatment? And this question, it took on a life of its own and kind of represents its own little kind of sub-study here. So this is titled Experts of Their Own Experience, Adolescent and Young Adult Cancer Patients' Advice as a Coping Mechanism. So, the original aims of this were to identify and describe independently adopted coping strategies used by AYAs. So not ones that were implemented by their, physician or different researchers, but ones that they kind of came up with themselves. And then to report advice that they have for other AYAs diagnosed with the malignancy. So we recruited over the span of several months, patients from the ages of 12 to 25, so kind of the younger end of the AYA spectrum, which defined by the NCI is like 15 to 39-year-olds. We recruited them from the adult and the pediatric oncology units within Michigan Health. So part of our criteria were that they were relatively recently diagnosed within the past year. And since this was originally part of a fertility study, they had to be at risk for some gonadal dysfunction following their cancer therapy. And so we conducted semi-structured interviews, which were designed to really elicit their thoughts on their general cancer experience, goals for the future, and their experience and understanding of fertility preservation practices. So these are our patient demographics, and just a couple things that I wanted to highlight on this. We ended up interviewing about 27 kids, pretty evenly split between our kind of really younger AYAs, 12 to 17, and then 18 to 25, which was about, maybe like 2/3 of the patient population. What I think is really interesting is where these patients were seen, which was a pretty even split. And this tends to be the case, that it's rather random, frankly, where AYAs end up being treated, whether it's at the pediatric or adult unit. And a lot of it depends on what ER they show up to. And our patient sample represented that it was about half and half. And then cancer type was very, very non-specific. We just broke it up into solid tumor versus not solid tumor. So like a leukemia, and it was pretty evenly split there. And then very homogeneous patient population, unfortunately, with the majority being white, which is a bit of a function from doing this in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So the themes that came up are, I'm going to focus on the last one, but as Nick was saying earlier, we have self-advocacy, which we really defined as, actively engaging with the medical team, independently seeking out information aside from what was, given in education sessions, really engaging with the support network and taking advantage of opportunities to connect with others. And then attitude framing, which I'll focus the majority of my part on, which was broken up into several sub-themes here. So some of these may seem paradoxical at first glance, but they do all really kind of fit together. So I'll kind of take you through some of these that we found to be really the most interesting. Almost all of the patients really stressed the importance of approaching this with a positive outlook. And this was not presented as kind of blindly going along with things or just kind of falsely keeping a positive outlook. It was more of an intentional way of approaching the situation. And many patients really stated that the more they actively tried to adopt this feeling of having a positive outlook, the better they felt physically. And that's really nicely illustrated by this young man with Hodgkin's lymphoma. And I won't read the whole thing to you, but hopefully you can appreciate how well that captures this need to have the positive outlook. A second major theme was exercising control over what you can. One of the really tough things about being diagnosed with cancer in this age group is that many patients are just beginning to exert some independence. They may have just, moved out of their parents' home and are just living on their own when, all of a sudden they're kind of hit with this cancer diagnosis and need to rely more on caregivers. And so AYAs almost universally really advised focusing on things that you can control. And they might seem really small, but doing that, allowed them to have agency over a situation where they felt like they had really kind of no choice in the matter. And that's really illustrated by this young man with a germ cell tumor, kind of saying you can't control how the chemo is going to make you feel or the anti-nausea drugs, but you can do other stuff in your life that can help you feel better. Permission to take time off was a big thing. Many of these patients had just started a new job or college and were extremely driven and had kind of seen themselves on a specific trajectory and really found it extremely helpful when a trusted friend or family member kind of allowed them to space to take some time off from their goals. And that afforded them the realization that many people take a gap year, in college, and it's okay to do that. And that kind of really nicely dovetails into the next one, which is don't give up on goals. That, even though you're hitting these barriers, your goals are still achievable, and to keep pushing for these things. The next two ones, I think we were really, it was really exciting to see these next two things, which were, the first one was many expressed feeling a new purpose in their chosen career path or education. And I think that's really nicely illustrated by this young woman with sarcoma, is that she had always wanted to be a journalist, but now really felt like she had a new purpose with focusing on healthcare journalism and having this new perspective about how helpful that would be, particularly with her new perspective with having been so embedded in the healthcare system and a patient herself. And then kind of along those lines, many young people reported this new perspective too, that I think is very well captured by this young man who, you know, it just said he didn't like school before. He didn't like, you know, going to work and those types of things. But having this diagnosis really put things into perspective for him, and he was able to appreciate smaller things in his life and not take things for granted as he may have had, you know, done before. And then finally, you know, a very, very poignant result was that many patients just really advised others to just keep fighting and, you know, acknowledging that there are going to be really tough days, but just to keep going, don't give up, don't sit around and mope around, keep your head up. It's not going to be like this every day. And I love this last one, you know, just stating there's a light at the end of the tunnel. You just got to push through it. So that's my portion. Here's a shameless plug for our AYA program here. The website's on top, and then a link to our research portion of our program, and then all these really wonderful organizations that provide support to AYA cancer patients. Thank you.
And I'll talk to Veronika, but we'll see if we can make these slides available to everyone after the presentation today as well. So yeah, so I'll jump in now and jump back in and talk about my two different data sets. One is from my dissertation, and the other one I collected at the start of COVID lockdowns. And so for each, I recruited participants through convenience, volunteer, and snowball or network sampling. So basically like asking around and hoping that people would pass along the study information to the people that they know. And then I started posting on my personal social media sites and reaching out to psychosocial young adult practitioners at nonprofits and university hospitals, and going to different young adult support groups. And so in order to participate in both of these studies, or either of these studies, the first one, again, for my dissertation, 31 young adult participants engaging in face-to-face interviews, and the video one, 54 during the COVID kind of initial months to a year of COVID. Anyway, in order to participate in these studies, people had to be 18 to 39 at their initial diagnosis and at the time of interview. Again, this is the National Cancer Institute's kind of designation for what qualifies as young adults. So again, the first study had to complete primary treatment. I was talking only to people who had entered into that survivorship phase in the first study. And in the second study, it didn't matter if they had been diagnosed recently, just as long as they had met with a cancer care provider between March 2020 and April 2021. So around the first year of COVID in the United States. And so again, these studies were both interested in these larger issues. I'm more of an interpersonal communication scholar, so I'm interested in kind of these conversations that happen in smaller numbers of people or in important relationships. So I was interested in how cancer caused a significant life disruption, or how they managed their uncertainty or reshaped their identity during their diagnosis or during their treatment, and how they sent and received social support, how they made treatment decisions, and how they used humor. And again, the thing that we kind of have in common here, I asked to end the interview, what advice would you give to another person your age who was just diagnosed with a similar cancer? So my participants were primarily from the Great Lakes region of the US. I did have 3 people from Ontario and 13 people from Kentucky, which is where I did my PhD. So participants mostly had leukemia, lymphoma, breast and testicular, and head and neck. So thyroid, tongue, salivary gland cancers, and sarcoma. And survivors were mostly white, female, 28 and a half years old at the time of interview. So kind of right in the middle of that YA, young adult age range, and almost 3 years out from the completion of primary treatment, though I did talk to about 8 people who were still experiencing their first time through treatment. Most did not experience a recurrence of the same cancer or a secondary diagnosis in a different part of the body. And we definitely recognize across all of these studies, again, these are all 3 qualitative studies, which tends to use kind of convenience or non-probability sampling. And so we recognize the need for like a nationally representative sample. And so maybe Lauren will be able to talk more about U of M's AYA program, our work at maybe hoping to get a sample like that. That's a little bit more comprehensive, but we have to work with what we have here. So the first theme describes how young adults advise others to seek and accept support from their larger social networks. So why was this helpful? So in the data set and in the existing kind of psychosocial research, young adults report that receiving emotional support from others, allowing them to vent and to cry and to laugh was so important. And again, I'll just leave the quotes up here like Emily and kind of talk through them. But young adults also discuss the practical importance of having a primary supporter or someone who can handle communication work, which is this concept, which I'll talk about in a second, but it can get so exhausting on top of the other cancer and on top of your other life kind of related responsibilities that you still have to manage following a diagnosis. But communication work is, maybe someone you can identify to do the kind of work that can, be another set of ears in doctors' offices, or who can send updates out to other supporters, or who can kind of filter or gatekeep or organize some of the more overwhelming support that the patient's receiving back. That could be really helpful to have somebody in that role. However, participants also suggested that keeping in mind that, designating this label to someone can be especially tough when you are a young adult and maybe you're in a newer committed dating relationship. So how do you navigate the question of who's the primary supporter, who's in charge of the communication work? When you have a care practitioner asking you to have someone come back with you, who is that person? COVID forced us to kind of all only be able to bring one person in. So young adults, this might be a tough decision. Could it be the parents, who might not want to let go of this responsibility that they've had for their kids' life up to this point, or to the significant other who can maybe view the patient as their future, who maybe feels like they have a lot of eggs in this basket and they want to say, or they want to take this role on for a person. So participants also cautioned against a few other barriers to receiving helpful support and some advice on how to maybe handle some of those. So the first, young adults raised the universal probability that not all of the support is going to be helpful, right? And that there could be someone that you expected maybe to be there for you who won't be. So I'm on the advisory board of a nonprofit organization in San Diego called Be Present, which is focused on helping supporters of AYAs with cancer feel comfortable and confident enough to show up and share this emotional space with patients. And so because this type of support tends to dwindle as treatment wears on, and because some people are so freaked out by cancer happening to a young person that they say unhelpful stuff or don't show up at all. So participants were concerned about other AYAs being able to cope with some of the more negative reactions that they could receive due to the shock that others experience when they disclose kind of cancer relevant information about themselves. So one thing they suggested was to not change your own behavior or your own mindset to others non-existent or unhelpful support. Again, stuff that's a little bit easier said than done, but they said that when others tell you how bad your treatment side effects will be, or that their older uncle who had the same cancer as you do died, or as Representative Desaulnier said, the stigma of cancer being a death sentence. When you hear things like that, try not to let it cause you to curl up into a ball and to keep going. Again, we talked about treatment adherence, sticking with treatment being one of the main reasons why young adults don't have as good of outcomes as other groups. And so maybe that's one of the reasons why. And so in many cases, as in this first quote here from Agnes, participants told other YAs to use their lack of helpful support as a way to gain a little insight into who some of these people are who aren't stepping up. So Brad said, maybe you don't need to be spending a ton of resources and time with these people who aren't giving you support. they said this says more about this person than it does about you. And you're getting the chance to learn who your real friends are. And you need to not give up in trying to find the right people to surround yourself with. But again, how do you do that? So again, many participants also said that they struggled to ask others for support or to accept the support that others gave them. And so young adults in particular struggle with the feeling that people doing nice things for them is a threat to their independence, or it makes them feel weak, or that it's a burden on others and they should feel guilty for needing help. And so they don't know how, or are sometimes unwilling to ask for support. And sometimes they hide their needs, like in this bottom picture, behind toxic positivity, which is a little bit more, not necessarily the nuance take that Emily was describing about positivity, but more when people kind of do not express their fears or their anger or their anxiety because they feel like it doesn't fit this socially acceptable image of a strong and optimistic cancer patient, or like a young adult in general, right? And so in this first quote, Kate admitted that she didn't follow her own advice about telling other people what she needed and accepting their help, even though she told other people to do so, but it was so difficult for her. And participants like Brad below mentioned how important it is to milk the resources that you do have available to you, and not to be vague or bashful about it, to explicitly tell your supporters exactly what you need. It's like you don't get many opportunities to be selfish or self-centered in your life, and this is definitely one of them, right? So do not be bashful. Finally, in terms of engaging support networks, young adult participants stress the importance of finding people outside of your everyday supporters to talk to. So, some participants had trouble being completely honest with their family caregivers, doing something we call in communication and psychosocial research, a protective buffering, where we're trying to maybe shield ourselves or our family members from feeling despair and discomfort. Sometimes we think that we will feel these feelings and other people will feel these feelings if we have these conversations. Sometimes it's effective to avoid these conversations. Other times it's not. So it just depends on the family and the relationship. But especially this transitional time when young adults are starting to be functional adults, like it's really easy to be viewed by your parents and your siblings and your other relatives as still a little kid. And so finding other people who can have honest conversations with you and who won't threaten that kind of conflicting support versus independence dynamic that I talked about, it can give you a little bit more of a helpful perspective. It's also helpful, they mentioned, to make sure you ask for privacy. So don't be afraid to tell your family members to leave if you want to talk to your doctor alone or something like that. So other participants mentioned how joining virtual support groups with other young adult patients and survivors, these virtual support groups were so popular during COVID, and they really, a lot of support organizations in regional areas of the United States pivoted really fast to virtual care or virtual sessions when COVID hit and people weren't supposed to congregate. And I think a lot of young adults liked the convenience and maybe some of the protection of taking these conversations online. And so they really blew up. And they said that it really helped them find other people who shared similar emotions about the pandemic. So in summary about support networks, young adults suggested asking for and accepting social support, but not to let unhelpful or non-existent support stop them from continuing to reach out to others. And then a little bit more quickly, my second theme was about self-advocacy. And so, again, the same definition that Emily brought up, young adults advise other YAs to be assertive advocates for their own mental and physical health, both during their actual appointments and in navigating the broader healthcare system. So this involved thinking about writing down and asking as many questions as possible during doctor visits to learn new information and to make sure you understand, and to speak up when you're unreasonably uncomfortable or when you have concerns. And so again, multiple participants said they were too shell-shocked or too embarrassed to raise their voice in these situations, or to at least have a conversation about it, right? And then finally, multiple patient participants talked about, quote, doing the work outside of the doctor's office to explore all their options and receive the best care possible. And so this involved braving their anxiety and getting online to search for more information and to avoid doom scrolling as much as possible, as this image shows. But again, as Representative Desaulniers said, getting online is not always the best idea. But in some cases, when you do need more information and you don't feel dissatisfied with the care you're receiving, it might be a good idea to look, right? And so if you don't feel comfortable getting online and educating yourself in that way, and if you have the means, right, there are obviously some time and some money and some care access barriers to this. But if you're able to get a second or a third or a fourth opinion from other practitioners, participants said that was really helpful, right? One participant said that they would have had to wait for 4 months to undergo a procedure from, quote, the popular surgeon during the early months of COVID, but they did the, quote, extra work and effort to find another surgeon that got them in sooner and who still makes them feel really at ease. They're still a really good surgeon. It also involved not taking no for an answer when navigating the healthcare system. So again, during COVID, one participant said, quote, just keep pushing, keep asking. The rules are there to be bent for sure. There's always an exception. You can always do something to just smuggle your mom in during COVID or something if you really need to. And then ultimately, I think this quote sums up the whole theme really well, but one participant argued, someone has to be their own advocate or needs to have somebody advocating for them. Because at the end of the day, nobody's going to put yourself first except for you, right? So with that, I'll turn it over to Lauren. We'll talk a little bit about some of the implications for all of these studies at the end.
Thank you, Nick. And it's great to add that and great to witness that I first met Nick as a participant in one of the studies that he presented. And so it's really exciting for me to be here listening to his results and participating in my own study analysis alongside this presentation. So next slide, please. So I'll be presenting some findings also from my dissertation study, which was titled Exploring Multi-Level Factors Influencing Quality of Life in Young Adult Cancer Survivors, a mixed method study. That was conducted at New York University Rory Myers College of Nursing. And the purpose of this initial study was to explore the relationship of work-related goals and quality of life in young adult hematologic cancer survivors, with a focus on multi-level factors at the individual and work levels. And this study was funded by the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. So I recruited and conducted interviews for this study from March to October 2020. So while initially planning for this study, did not think that it would be occurring during and throughout the COVID pandemic. And so there were several modifications and iterations of the interview guide to kind of account for what was going on in the employment and work settings of these young adult cancer survivors. And one of the modifications came with including this question. And it was after the first interview that we included, what do you know now about young adult cancer survivorship that you wish you knew when you were first diagnosed? And this question was the impetus for this current presentation. Next slide. So the analysis was a secondary data analysis, and interviews, as I mentioned, were conducted on Zoom. They were transcribed verbatim, and then a rapid content analysis was performed using a qualitative software called MaxQDA. Next slide. And so all participants provided informed verbal consent and electronic consent. Participants were young adult cancer survivors, meaning that they were aged 20 to 39 years old at diagnosis, which was a self-report diagnosis of leukemia or lymphoma. Participants must have been diagnosed within 1 to 5 years. They also had to be working and or attending school to any extent at the time of the cancer diagnosis. And they were excluded if they were currently receiving active cancer treatment and or had a life expectancy of less than 6 months. We use what's called maximum variation sampling on specific variables to obtain as heterogeneous sample as possible in terms of the following variables: sex, race, age at diagnosis, and type of work. And next slide. So I recruited participants online through social media platforms. As we know, young adult cancer survivors are digital natives. And I recruited through also young adult cancer survivor groups. And recruitment took approximately 4 months. The pie chart on the left displays the social media sites that were used in the recruitment efforts, with the majority of our participants coming from Facebook. And the right was our study flyer that we used. And so the method of recruiting through social media was effective in terms of reaching as nationally representative as we could with 40 participants. Here you'll see the purple states indicate where the young adult cancer survivors participated from. And so we had a representation of 23 states across the US. And so in this study, roughly 73% of the young adult participants were white, 65% were female with a median age of 28 years. Additional demographics are shown here, but just to show that this was an educated, insured sample, and it fell into 3 predominant work sectors. And then from a clinical perspective, most reported a diagnosis of lymphoma and were on average 2.5 years from their primary diagnosis. And so the main finding here is centered around the normalization of mental health support, which we've heard about a lot today, and we know is very important to adolescent and young adult cancer survivors. But this normalization of mental health support consisted of young adult cancer survivors reflecting on their pre-cancer diagnosis self and then preparing for their post-treatment self. We heard from many young adult survivors that they wish that they had known and been prepared for just how hard it was going to be mentally for them, even after their treatment ended. As one participant here reminded us, cancer doesn't end when treatment ends. And I know I've heard that, I've said that many times. And it's kind of this echoing sound to really advocate that there are needs that go beyond the active treatment period. And so I've included a few quotes that really bring home the central theme, and I'll share them. The first is from a 28-year-old female who said, "You expect surviving to be the end of it and to move on with your life. And it's not that way. No one really tells you, no, this will change you forever. You have to make a new path for yourself and to get to know the new you." Next slide. A 35-year-old female said, "When you're first finished, you have this exhilarating feeling where you think you're gonna have this amazing life. Then you have to face the reality of all the stuff. It feels a lot more alone because you go from during treatment when everyone is helping you. But a year out, I feel better now. It's like I said, it's ups and downs. At first, it's like, whoa, and then you kind of crash. I don't know. Everything's always changing." And this really gets on the uncertainty of having to navigate the experience of and the trajectory of survivorship. And a 23-year-old female said, "I wish I knew just about all this afterwards crap. I wish I knew to be getting help. Then that way I knew how to react now to certain things, like therapy, to prepare myself for what is to come. Of course, you're excited to be out and stuff, but you really have no idea what you're doing. I feel like I've always felt like life is like a book. You're just going through your pages, your whatever. I feel like cancer, it wasn't another chapter. It's a whole nother book. I'm having to figure out who I am all over again and what this new body is like and all the stuff I have to deal with." I like to share these quotes because I firmly believe that they're powerful pieces of advocacy and advice directly from young adult cancer survivors, centered around preparedness of what's next and what's after. And as Emily and Nick shared with their data as well, there's no real clear answer to that because of all the uncertainty that cancer brings during this tumultuous time of young adulthood. Next slide, please. And lastly, a 26-year-old male stated, "How you feel, how you think, your beliefs, what you stand for, what you want, what you think you've accomplished, your outlook, everything is different. I think once a young adult cancer fighter and survivor understands that and really accepts it and grasps it, they will accept things easier. Because I've been able to accept things a lot better once I stopped comparing myself to my old self, once I stopped mourning my old self. It's just like, okay, that was you then, this is you now. And it's okay that this is you now. Don't guilt yourself that this is you now. Just try and find that comfort and happiness in who you are now because you are different. You can't go back even if you tried." These are all powerful reminders and advice to not only empower other young adult cancer survivors and advocates, but also to providers. And one specific implication shown here around normalizing mental health support and referrals during and post-active therapy are critical for young adult cancer survivors' quality of life. One 23-year-old female advised providers, at least talk to them, talk to you and say, "This is what happens most of the time," or "with a lot of patience," or whatever. "If you're experiencing this, it's normal." She further went on to say, "That's what you feel like. You feel like it's not normal, like you need to be different, because you don't ever hear of it. No one ever talks about that stuff. You talk about it between cancer patients, but you don't talk about it publicly. No one truly knows what's going on. This shows how even saying, if you're experiencing this, it's normal. Providing that normalization can bring so much comfort at a time of drastic uncertainty. So overall, normalizing mental health support and receiving mental health support is a key piece of advice for AYA cancer survivors. I'm going to stop here and turn it back to Nick to help us think through more implications and future directions. So thank you.
Sure. Yeah. And so thanks, Lauren. That was awesome. And so I think Lauren and Emily and I kind of sat down and spitballed just off the top of our heads some implications from our studies and maybe some future directions. And I want to quickly go through these almost as a springboard into kind of a Q&A with Veronika. And again, if you haven't asked any questions or dropped anything in the chat, please, I encourage you to do so. So with whatever remaining time we have left, we can kind of be interactive during the session. But so I think one of the goals of the study was to learn about some of the biggest stressors or disruptions or uncertainties or unmet needs that either do or don't go talked about in the larger kind of conversation about AYA cancer. But what typically does come up between young adults when they talk to each other who've shared this common experience of a cancer diagnosis. And so maybe learning some of these things are useful for training, not only for practitioners to know better when to refer out to different resources, to know that these resources do exist and that young adults are particularly interested in them. But maybe to, University of Michigan has a really good AYA advisory group. And so maybe installing an AYA advisory group at other hospitals. And so this type of information can be readily on hand. Also the question of who should be giving this advice to other AYAs. Should it come through peer-to-peer support groups or support programs? Like Immerman's Angels is a really popular one where you're kind of paired up with somebody who's gone through a diagnosis and a cancer experience before. Should it come out through support groups in general? Or, is all advice appropriate for AYAs, and when? Is it really easy to get an information overload, as we see a lot of time with social supports, where it reaches a certain point where people are like, you got to stop sharing this stuff with me. I don't want to hear all of this. There's so much going on right now. I can't process this until later. And so when is the right time to share this advice, and what is the best kind of forum and way in which to deliver it, right? And so there's a lot of communication research on that for sure. Toxic positivity, we talked a little bit about this too, as one of the kind of guidelines for attitude framing, and again, this kind of very specific, very intentional attempt to make yourself, stay on the positive side, as long as it doesn't conflict with these feelings of sadness and hopelessness and anger that you're not expressing, right? So we don't want the positivity to take precedent over these other emotions, to make it to a point where it's difficult to speak up if someone needs help. And we see a lot of other cancer organizations that are catered more to general or older populations that kind of trade a lot more in the hope and the pink and optimism, and we're all going to get through this together, and sometimes at the expense of having more honest conversations. And also, adolescents, young adults, a unique concern to them is it's hard to accept social support. And so it's important to maybe train them to voice what they do want out of social support, and to be able to distinguish between support that is helpful and unhelpful to them. And so thinking about this in terms of conflicting goals, right? It's a lot of times when you have to give someone advice or give someone support, it might interfere with their need to have an identity of being independent. And it might be foreign to our relationship, where it's been kind of a balanced support dynamic before, and now one person's in charge of giving me all the support, and it feels weird. And so balancing those relational and identity goals with the task goals might be a way to kind of think about that. And then again, maybe looking into a nationally representative sample where we can get advice from a much larger group, and so that we can feel like, we're not overrepresenting a more homogeneous population of white, affluent, educated, mostly female participants. We want to hear from everybody the same way that they are represented in the United States. And so I'll open it up to everybody else, Lauren, Emily, Veronika, whatever we want to do next. Let's go for it. Or Lauren and Emily, if you want to comment on any of these as well.
Thanks, Nick. I think one thing I would just add is that, I know for myself as a physician, just participating in research like this has made me, I hope a better physician, and just being aware of these issues that aren't, kind of immediately obvious. I think, oftentimes we can err on the side of really stressing like the end of therapy, and just really appreciating how, as you pointed out, Lauren, that doesn't mean that like life suddenly snaps back to normal. And, appreciating that oftentimes it means that there is actually more kind of mental distress after therapy is done. And that, while patients are getting treatment, they're often occupied with, all the, just logistical demands of getting therapy, and then the side effects of treatment. And then it's not until that all ends that there's really time to kind of sit and ruminate, about what they've been through and what their diagnosis means. And so just the importance of practitioners of really being aware of these issues.
I think one other thing that I just wanted to mention, I know Nick and I have talked about this at length too, and I don't know if both Nick and Emily experienced this with their interviews, but when I first posed this question to participants, many of them had to sit and pause for a second to really think about the processing. How would I respond to this? And many were like, just give me a second, or, oh, that's a really hard question. Because we know that everyone's experience is unique. And we also know that as a receiver of a lot of advice and a lot of information as a young adult cancer survivor, we also sometimes filter how we give that advice to others. Mm-hmm. So I think that as it comes to young adult cancer survivors receiving and giving advice, it can be really challenging sometimes. And so maybe some of this resonated with you as a young adult cancer survivor, maybe it didn't, and that's okay too. I think what's really exciting in the space of AYA cancer research is that there's been huge growth of psychosocial research. So I think that we do need to hear everybody's experiences. And so if you do see a call for a study, even if you don't know exactly what the study's about, contact the principal investigator, contact the study coordinator, because we do want to get the most experiences and the most voices possible.
Yeah, I think, Lauren, that's such a good point. And what I would add to that, I think something that I was so happy to see is that many of our participants were really appreciative that we were doing a study like this and soliciting their opinion. And it really, it was kind of an eye opener for me that they felt like this is the first time they had been, asked for like, what do you think about all this? Like, did any of this make sense? What your doctor was saying to you, instead of like the usual sign this consent and, give us this blood draw for, that kind of thing. It was a very different study. And I'm hopeful that our participants, appreciated that these questions were being asked, and it seemed like they did.
I want to thank you all for that lovely presentation. And this is I have a great question, which is a great segue into the Q&A. And please feel free, all the participants in the audience, if you would like to ask questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A. But my first, as a researcher, I put my researcher hat on, and also being a young adult cancer survivor, being diagnosed at 25 with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and going through that as a master's student, who I was lucky enough to have the ability to just move back home and be taken care of by my mom. So I didn't, I was able to depend on her resources, essentially. She was able to take care of me at that stage. But the AYA continuum, to be able to research, the experiences of the high school graduate who's going to college for the first time, and the mother of two at home who is providing a support system to others, maybe her children, her parents, her grandparents. How do we study all of that? How do we make sense of all of that? And how can we use it to better outcomes, because as you started off the talk, young adult cancer there is a huge disparity in outcomes.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can take it first. So I think there's two minds of this. Initially, I think that this kind of consortium was formed, or this age group was formed, because not only because we saw these kind of weird outcomes, or these more negative outcomes occurring in this particular age-bounded group, but because I think the argument was, well, 15 to 39-year-olds have more in common than members of an older age group or younger age group, right? So even though there are these vast differences between 15 and 39-year-olds, there's still areas of maturation or being more kind of disconnected from a steadier kind of more concrete relationship and life situation than when you're older, or when you're younger, when you haven't really figured out your identity out yet and you're kind of more at the mercy of your parents. I feel more convinced that we're going to be moving in a direction of breaking things up even more. So that, Lauren talks so much about, as a qualitative researcher, I love this too, but this individual experience and the unique experience of cancer. And, while you could still have a 21-year-old who's more emotionally mature than a 38-year-old in some cases, just depending on their life circumstances, it's more like, their emotional maturity rather than their age. I think we're going to start to see more patterns and more similarities if we start looking at adolescents. So 15 to 18-year-old or 15 to 17-year-olds, emerging adults. And so there's been this kind of psychological theory in the last 15 years called emerging adulthood that looks primarily at 18 to 25-year-olds as this kind of untethered. And, again, as my, age group, millennials, and the age groups beneath us, Gen Z, wait to get married longer and wait to settle down and have kids longer, this emerging adulthood gap might get bigger generationally, where it's more of a time for you to kind of sit and explore and not commit to anything yet. And then, 26 to 38, again, that might even be too early now to look at that kind of young adult phase. But again, it's so hard because you could have a 22-year-old, fewer and fewer people these days, but you can have a 22-year-old who's married with kids. And so that's, I think, the way it was initially pitched in 2007, but I'm starting to see more of an effort to kind of break things up a little bit more. And so Emily and Lauren, I don't know if you have more to add, please.
I would just piggyback off of that and say, depending on what your research question is, and I feel
Yes.
like my dissertation advisor is in my head right now, is really how you may break up either stratifying by age group or even by diagnosis in terms of treatment time and time since treatment completion. And so I think that there definitely have studies that have looked just at the adolescent period, especially, and now we're seeing more with financial hardship too, and differences between earlier adolescents and then, older young adults. So I think that there's ways in the methods of a study that can be accounted for.
And I would just add on the kind of clinical end of things, one way we're trying to address this in our AYA program, kind of previously through the cancer support community, which is a fantastic organization, but previously their AYA support group was 15 to 39-year-olds. And you can kind of see why that would be tough, right? Because it's extremely different phases of life. So one thing that we're trying to do is have more experiential, so like a parent support group, like college students, high school, trying to kind of be a bit more granular. So that's our kind of attempt at, addressing the vastly different, developmental, milestones that are within that kind of defined group.
Thank you. My next question has to do with you all focused on the advocacy piece, and at NCCS we work with advocates who are champions for themselves and in their communities to help others. But not everyone is able to advocate for themselves. Not everyone has the capacity, the health literacy. Many people don't know what to ask, the unknown of healthcare. And then add a pandemic and the trust of healthcare, which that could be question number 2. But how can we better support AYAs to be able to advocate for themselves? And how do we build better relationships between the healthcare system and AYAs? Because we sometimes hear, there are symptoms, there's no way you could have cancer, that there's no trust, and there's no, the active listening could be better, right? Representative Desanier commented about communication. Sometimes it's a little lacking. And so what tips or tricks or that we can do to improve our health communication?
Yeah, I think the first kind of touchstone, and many people who get diagnosed with cancer, especially as a young adult, when it's very surprising, comes out of nowhere, and you're diagnosed kind of at a later stage because it's misdiagnosed, it presents as something else for a long time. I think the first point of contact needs to be from someone in the healthcare system, right? Unfortunately, we know that this isn't always happening. It depends on, kind of where you're getting treatment. But for example, Emily talked about the study we did, the first study we did as the part of the AYA CARES program at U of M was focused on fertility, infertility risk, and fertility preservation, conversations between healthcare providers and patients, and how satisfied they were with those conversations, and how those conversations can be better. And so we talked to the patients from their perspective. And one of the things that we saw some pretty good feedback on was the fact that U of M has a dedicated oncofertility kind of program, and when they have social workers that are just only focused on getting the patient ready for for the conversation around fertility preservation or infertility risk. And in a lot of cases, you hear over and over again, young adults don't preserve their fertility because they don't know, in a lot of cases, that cancer treatment can affect that. And there's so many other things on their minds, more of the kind of larger health uncertainty and health concerns, that things like that, where people don't really have a solid idea before they have cancer, what they want to do with kids, gets pushed off to after treatment. And in some cases, it's too late. And so I think intervention before someone even knows that they have cancer, when possible, needs to come from the healthcare system, and then maybe filter out to some of these other support organizations like Stupid Cancer, like Be Present, like First Descents, that can help with other areas as well.
Yeah, I would just piggyback on that and saying that as a patient and as a highly health literate patient too, I wasn't aware of a lot of the resources, the psychosocial resources, until I outwardly sought them. And I was like, wow, that would have made my life a lot easier when you think about communication work that Nick brought up, but just the work of scoping out that and seeing, like, is this going to be a good fit for me? Am I going to like a trip like First Descent? Am I going to like one-on-one support with another peer? And I know that there are more and more AYA programs, popping up in oncology centers. And I know that young adults are seeking, these first line of supports through online first. And so I think that if we can close that gap of, bringing it first to the patient, and it's not just, okay, you just got diagnosed in your first visit, here's a folder of everything, because we know that's not working. We know there's a lot of information overload. But I will say personally for me, my only interaction with an oncology social worker was during my first treatment, where I was like actively nauseous. And I was just like, please don't come now. And then they never came back. And so I had wished that there was another circle back. So when we think about, from clinicians, when we can approach patients with these resources, how we're delivering them to the patients. And a lot of that is now on implementation science, and it's great that, we're starting to think about, not only is this intervention going to work, but is it going to be used, and when can we implement it? And so I think those are just things to keep in mind if you're listening here as the patient, but ask, what are my resources if I'm, experiencing a lot of fear of recurrence, or what, I know I'm having anxiety about an upcoming scan. What can I do? What can I talk to? And we know that there's a real shortage of psycho-oncologists. And so are there other ways that we can, as patients, look for mental health providers or other support? So it's a hard question, and not one approach is going to work, like we said, for every single person. So it's the work on the patient, also work on the provider, and the care team too. So if that's something that you can offload to a supportive care partner, say, I know I need therapy, but I can't think about it right now. Can you just research my insurance and see what that will look like? That can also help.
Okay, so I believe the session has come to a close, and I know there's some questions that we didn't get to, but we have them. So I'll be happy to take a stab or share them with our panel. And I want to thank you all for joining us today and sharing the voices of adolescent and young adult cancer survivors. They're important to us, and we need to hear more of them. We need to hear more diverse voices, which you pointed out in your research. And thank you for being here. And with that, we will have a 10-minute break. Thank you all, and we will be back shortly for our next session.